I think we do recognize that, again, in many of these far-flung places where they're very high costs, it can be a great opportunity to be the demonstration, to be the pilot. Because if you can make these technologies pencil out in a high-cost environment, they're going to be okay elsewhere. So we encourage that and understand. I certainly understand the role that that certainly DOE plays within the R&D and how we can really use these as the incubators of the good ideas. But you've got to have a place to test them, and you do fail. And I know it's tough for some people to realize that, but sometimes that failure actually allows us to succeed on the next time around instead of just shutting it down and saying, no, we couldn't. So enough of that. I want to direct this question to you, Dr. Medlock. We had a really interesting hearing about a month ago here in the committee. We had Dr. Birol, who is the executive director of the International Energy Agency, and he presented the 2018 World Energy Outlook. And one of the things that he started with, he had 4 upheavals, and the first upheaval was the fact that the U.S. is becoming the undisputed global oil and gas leader. And, you know, that's exciting, certainly exciting for a state like mine that is an oil and gas producer and contributor. But it kind of begs the question. It's one thing to have the resource, and it's another thing to be able to move the resource, whether it's the wind in Texas or whether it's the oil on the North Slope. You have to have the infrastructure. So the question to you is, given your understanding of the energy markets, the critical role of transportation and trade in these markets, are we ready for this? Are we prepared for the growth in oil and gas production and LNG exports, given the infrastructure that we have and knowing of the need to move it to those areas where it can provide the country with the greatest value?
There is a lot of infrastructure investment that is still needed to connect those supplies to viable markets. We published a study back in 2015 when the discussion about the export debate or export ban was raging. And one of the things we pointed out is that lifting the ban would unlock a tremendous amount of pent-up capital aimed at not only developing resource, but allowing it access to markets that it never had access to before. And you're actually seeing that occur in the state of Texas, for example. Connecting the Permian Basin to the Gulf Coast is something that is occurring increasingly every day. Expansion of port facilities, development of pipeline facilities, development of petrochemical plants that have access to those export outlets. All sorts of things are going on. So that needs to continue to occur if the wealth of the United States is to continue to grow in the energy space. I mean, you go back 15 years, and who would have dreamed that we'd be talking about the United States as one of the largest oil producers in the world, well, exporters in the world, and an energy superpower. These are all terms that have been used by the previous administration and now this one. So, you know, this hopefully is not a disputed fact politically. It also conveys tremendous geopolitical advantage for the United States. Conversations by consuls around the world really do focus largely on the U.S.'s ability to project energy dominance around the planet. So it conveys tremendous advantages in those regards. But, and this is actually very important, none of that is going to happen absent the very unique legal institutions that we have in this country and regulatory facilities that we have in this country. And anything that upsets any of those things, and they're laid out in my written testimony, will actually throw a wrench in the wheel, so to speak. And that can actually keep things from occurring. I mean, the United States, for example, is the only country in the world where landowners own mineral rights. There's not another one in the world. So that actually gives developers the ability to negotiate directly with landowners, and you get this incentive compatibility that triggers development. Now, that's not enough, right? So geology is a necessary condition. You need that very unique treatment of property rights, but you also need the ability to move and market, and that's something that is unique about the United States. You look at the natural gas market, for example. It is arguably one of the most efficient energy markets on the planet, and that owes everything to the ability to expand infrastructure based on pricing signals that are realized because there's real communication between consumers and producers. So anything that gets in the way of that communication can stand to disrupt everything all the way back through the value chain. And this is actually why earlier I mentioned it's important to recognize the interrelated nature of all infrastructure. Because if one thing slips, the whole engine shuts down. And so it's really important to recognize the efficiencies that the current environment have wrought from the United States.
Well, I appreciate that. Let me talk a little more broadly about this cooperative federalism that was raised by several of you. And if other colleagues have raised it in their questions, I apologize as I was out. But it does speak to some of what we're seeing today. You have a clear need in a region, but you have states, you have municipalities, localities that have clearly their view of a particular product or project. But I guess, and I throw this out to any of you who wish to speak to it. Obviously, Mr. Santa, I would hope that you would. But what should Congress be doing in this vein to ensure that the federal and the state governments respect one another's rules, don't abuse the authority that they each have or the delegation that they've been given under federal laws, recognizing that you have a product, whether it's natural gas, we'll just use that as an example here, but you need to move it to an area, but you got to move by others. And just the issue that we face in respecting both the state and the federal authority. So given that, what should our role here in Congress be?
Well, let me begin by saying I think often this issue gets framed in terms of state versus federal roles, and I think it's important to think about it in terms of state versus state. For example, the fact that the state of New York blocks a pipeline, that deprives the Pennsylvania and its citizens of a market for their natural gas. And similarly deprives the citizens of the states downstream of that pipeline from the ability to have access to more affordable natural gas. And so I think in that sense, it's uncooperative federalism that we are seeing. I think there are two things that Congress can do. First of all, clarify what is the appropriate role of the states acting under that authority that has been assigned to them. And then second of all, providing some recourse in an event that a state oversteps its bounds or acts in a way that is contrary to the national interest. For example, under the Coastal Zone Management Act, there is the ability to take an administrative appeal back to the Secretary of Commerce rather than going to a federal court where it's administrative law standards that are very, very deferential to the agency that took the action. Could something like that be done under the Clean Water Act?
Anybody else? Mr. Moeller?
Well, I think Don summed it up quite well. When it's about interstate commerce, there's more than just states involved, or individual states, and I think his example with Pennsylvania, New York, and the New England states is a very poignant one.
Very good. Let me turn to Senator Smith.